Welcome to the Legacy Radio Network. This is the Everything Financial Radio Show. I'm your host, Dennis Tubbergen. I am here every week at this time, and I'm awfully glad you decided to tune in today. We have a lot to talk about. Mr. Ian Gordon will be stopping by. Frequent guest, Mr. Ian Gordon. He's with the Long Wave Group. He is an economic historian, and we're going to pick his brain today and say, Mr. Gordon, tell us when the economic conditions that we see that exist today have existed at some point in the past, and what can we expect here? Where are we going to go from here? You're going to love our conversation with Mr. Gordon. Very informative. If you have a nest egg, if you have money in an IRA or 401k, you'll certainly want to stay tuned and listen to what Mr. Gordon's perspective is. Also, you may not believe it, but in today's show's second segment, I'm going to explain to you that Obamacare is creating jobs. No, I haven't gone off the deep end. But Obamacare is creating jobs. Trouble is, it's creating part-time jobs, and those that are working part-time are now working fewer hours. That has, in my view, artificially reduced the unemployment rate. We'll talk about that. I'll give you the numbers, and I'll walk you through the math. And in the last segment of today's show, I want to talk to you about regulation gone wild. There is a company by the name of Buckingham Slate who was fined $4,000 recently by a federal official for not putting a lid on a trash can, and $70,000 because one of its trucks had an inoperable horn. Regulation has gone nuts. We're going to talk to you about some examples. You won't believe some of the things that I'm going to share with you. And also, new jobs trend that's a bit disturbing. There's an emergence of what are known as Tier 2 workers at companies all across the country. Not necessarily good news for workers, certainly not good news for those that are middle class. I want to remind you that if you've not attended one of our discovery groups, you can do so, or register to do so, I should say, by going to personallegacyseminars.com. All the information about what we discuss at our discovery groups are there. Would certainly encourage you to go check it out. And also, again, a reminder, we have our 2012 guide, Surviving a Market Crash, post-election edition. You can get that by going to investingapproach.com. We'll be glad to send it to you. It's got a number of different handouts with economic research. There's also a CD. Consider it a second opinion in today's economy. We are obviously expecting that there is a high probability that we will see a significant market decline. And this tells you what you might want to do to protect your wealth and what you may do to potentially get some growth in today's economic environment. I am pleased to have back with me on the Everything Financial Radio Show Mr. Ian Gordon. Ian is a frequent guest. Love to have him on. He has a terrific perspective as to where we are economically speaking, based on his study of the Kondratiev wave theory and certainly monetary history. So, Ian, always a pleasure to have you on the show, and we appreciate you taking time out to be here.
Well, I'm always happy to be with you.
Ian, in your most recent newsletter, you talk about a developing Canadian housing crisis. Could it be that Canada is following the same path as the United States, just lagging it by 5 or 6 years?
Well, I'm pretty well convinced that is going to be the case. I've long been sort of advising that the Canadian consumer debt was approaching U.S. consumer debt before the housing crisis developed in the United States. So we're basically at the same level here in Canada, and the whole thing is that we're going into what I call the depression stage of the economy, and so when you get into a depression, that sort of the depression sort of shows that you have massive unemployment rates. The economy basically cuts by a considerable amount, and therefore things like housing prices that have to, under those circumstances, have to go down substantially because a lot of people that are in those houses can't afford the mortgages, and we've seen that happening in the United States. Here in Canada, we've sort of been somewhat shielded by the economic events that are occurring not only in the United States but in Europe as well, up to this point in time. But I think, as you've just said, I think we're just 4 or 5 years behind. Our debt is, we have a massive debt load. The consumer debt load is very, very large. And when our economy really starts to go into the tailspin that the other economies around the world, particularly in Europe and in the United States, are sort of feeling right now, they're sort of, they call it the Great Recession, but it is the beginnings of the Great Depression. And when our economy goes that way, everything is going to drop. We're going to start to see rising unemployment. We're going to see a lot of home foreclosures, and we're going to experience the same, really, as the U.S. consumer has already experienced.
You know, it's interesting. I had Harry Dent on the program a few weeks ago, and he mentioned he was in Vancouver for a conference to speak, and was having a conversation with a cab driver on the way to the airport, and the cab driver told him that his house had appreciated to $900,000. So when you start hearing stories like that that are a bit irrational, that a cab driver is living in an almost $1 million home, that really kind of smells like a bubble, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, it is a bubble. I mean, particularly here, you know, I'm not actually right in Vancouver, but I'm just south of Vancouver on the Pacific. But, you know, house prices have gone, in Vancouver, have gone absolutely astronomical because, you know, there's a lot of Asian money coming into Vancouver and here along the West Coast, and that's been pushing prices up. But I've now noticed that that money is not coming in anymore. And the other thing, you know, you just have to see, you know, here I live in a little city called White Rock, and you just have to see, just walking around the streets and so on, the for sale signs and how long those for sale signs have been up now here in White Rock, and how many signs say reduced. So we're just at the beginnings of the housing crisis that has been apparent in the United States. And I know in the United States there's somewhat of been a recovery, but that's going to be, you know, that's all going to turn for the worse again in the United States as the economy starts to go down again. And it's apparent right now that the economy is slowing in the United States and elsewhere around the world.
Ian, when somebody hears you use the term depression, that's certainly a very scary term to use, and you had mentioned once the economy starts to decline again, give us your estimation of how much more downside is there in maybe the U.S. housing market, and give us your thoughts as to where you think the employment rate or unemployment rate will end up.
Well, you know, the best example that we have really is the last depression, the 30s depression, to sort of draw from. But and all these depressions, they always occur in the winter of the quadrennial for a long wave cycle, and that season in the cycle is always the time when debt has to be wrung out of the economy, and that's the process that the central banks around the world are trying to resist, that process of debt being taken out of the economy. And so what happened in the last depression, and we'll use the United States because the economy, the U.S. economy was the biggest economy by a long shot in the world, about 40% of the total world economy going into the 30s. And the U.S. economy dropped by 45%. In other words, GDP collapsed by 45% between 1929 and 1933. And unemployment by 1933 was at 25%. So if we go back and say, well, you know, are we going to see the same kind of situation this time? Probably, you know, in my opinion, it's going to be worse because the debt is far worse than it was going into the last depression. Certainly the U.S. government going into the last depression had negligible debt. I think it was something like $20 billion total debt going into the depression, and the U.S. government had been paying down debt during the Roaring '20s. Now the U.S. is a massive debtor nation, $16 trillion and growing. Roosevelt was able to try and fight that depression by massive government spending. He wasn't that successful. Unemployment was always in double digits going into the Second World War. So we're going to go through an experience that's going to be an economic experience that's going to be devastating to essentially all of us. So I don't know whether the unemployment rate will get to 30, 35% or whatever, but I'm sure it's going to be worse than the 25% that was experienced between 1929 and 33.
In the time that's left in this segment, if someone would like to learn more about your work, what would you advise that they do?
Well, they can go to the website, which is longwavegroup.com, and that is currently a subscriber website, but I'm going to actually make it a free website effective January 1. So, and there's a lot of good information. We draw very much from the past. We draw from the sort of a historical perspective. We use the past to evaluate where we are in the present. So I think it's a great, from my perspective, it's a good history lesson, and it's also a very good lesson on the economics and financial happenings around the world at the present time.
All right, well, we will continue our conversation with Mr. Ian Gordon of the Long Wave Group when Everything Financial Radio returns here on the Legacy Radio Network. Stay with us.